Hello world, happy Webinar Wednesday. It's Dr. Deborah Thompson here from One Health Lessons, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce you all to Professor Sabeur. He is a professor of data science and artificial intelligence at Bournemouth University in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Professor Sabeur, for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here, as I have said, and you are a professor of data science and artificial intelligence. That sounds like a huge job, and it sounds like you've had a lot of interesting stories in the background there. So if you don't mind just introducing yourself so everybody can be familiar with who you are, that would be wonderful.
Thank you ever so much, Deborah. Where should I start? I started my studies at Glasgow University in Scotland more than 30 years ago, where I did my PhD in lattice quantum chromodynamics. Quantum chromodynamics, my PhD was really about understanding how the universe transitioned from kind of soup of all sorts of matter to a more organized matter that we're living in. And to prove that, we need to go back to those conditions and see if there is a transition. And to do that, you can't do it. Basically, you can't do this complex transition that happened billions of years ago. Can't do it using a pen or a calculator here. So I'm trying to simplify. You need some powerful computers to run and simulate those conditions to see if there is a transition, and it works. And that's why I got my PhD. So, and then I went on at various universities, such as Strathclyde universities, where I looked at molecular systems. In Strathclyde, I was a research fellow, and then I moved on as a senior research fellow at Leeds University, where I looked at what we call molecular fluids. But then again, after that, I wanted to do things for the environment. I was very much interested on the impact of, climatic changes that we were encountering, sea level rises and so on, and causing erosion of coastals and so on. So I was very much interested on wave impact in coastal structures, for instance. And I was contacted while I was at Leeds I was I was given a job offer at Oxford Brookes University, which is a young university in Oxford, and also working in collaboration with the Department of the Environment. The funding was by the Department of the Environment of the UK government, pointed to develop what we call free surface flow models. Free surface flows, these are waves, these are transient waves, these are powerful waves that can hit coastal structures and destroy these structures. In order to protect the coast, you need to develop these coastal structures to avoid flooding and so on. But in reality, you can look what nature does to encounter these big waves and how erosion is avoided is by developing mangrove zones. That nature does it properly. So the interest is really to see how the waves are attenuated by porous structures rather than solid structure. First and foremost, you need to develop these models. These are free surface flow. The boundary is free, and that's a tough problem in mathematics to solve. But I was one of the first who developed a stable model. There were only two models available at the time, and I was the third model. I developed the third model in the UK, stable to look at the pressures at impact with these structures and after impact. What happens? If you are able to do the wave before impact, the wave flow before impact, at impact, and before impact, you will get all the impact pressures time series.
Right.
These are powerful waves and they are very transient, but they do a lot of damage in the long term. They are like knives at the structures, and
Right.
they destroy the structure gradually in time. It's basically these knives that just hitting these structures. They are pointy pulses of pressures, really powerful pressures. And these are if we say pressures, we say forces. These are powerful forces like needles on the structure, just destroying them with time.
With water.
With water, yes. I left Oxford and I came to Southampton, but I had a student doing a PhD with me. We carried on the work doing the porous structures, and you can prove with porous structures you can attenuate much more efficiently these transient waves.
Interesting. So it
Yeah.
reminds me of something that was happening out in California when I was living out there. There was an issue with sea otters. Sea otters were dying because of a disease, and then because they're considered a keystone species, once they're gone, then the ecosystem collapses. So what happened is that the sea urchin population went up, meaning that the kelp forest, the integrity of the kelp forest went down, which then increased erosion because the water did not have the friction, did not have the resistance, so it went right into the shoreline and was hurting the properties right along.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we need to work with nature. We need to. We don't put defenses that are solid to stop the wave, but instead we recuperate the wave forces and create green energy out of it. That's the message I'm giving. But you need to simulate all of this using data and develop
It
models.
sounds like when we as humans are handling such a problem that's so complicated, something that has so many variables involved, that
Absolutely.
it would behoove us to get artificial intelligence in there to start to look at the data that has been collected by people and work and figure out how there are manageable solutions. Yeah, it
Yeah,
just
somehow you are correct. However, uh, 50 years ago, we were relying on equations, mathematically founded equations to actually describe a particular phenomenon. And these equations work when you solve them to predict how this phenomenon or a set of processes unfolds. AI comes in when you don't have those equations. You see the phenomenon happening, but you cannot interpret it through fundamental equations. You see, so science has undergone a particular paradigm. It's called the fourth paradigm, where intensive computing comes in line with AI to be plugged in to actually tell us how this phenomenon could unfold in space or time and so on, without knowing the equations.
right. This is why I wanted to have a conversation with you today, because when it comes to AI and climate change, or AI and any other One Health issue, meaning having an impact on
Yeah,
human and environmental health, how can artificial intelligence play a role in that?
yeah. Health is a good example. The diseases, how diseases develop. We have no equations on that. We don't have the mathematics to describe how these diseases develop in the human body.
So, do you think you mentioned earlier to me one-on-one that AI would have been quite helpful, and it was helpful with the pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm thinking with more advancement of artificial intelligence, say the next generation, or even say in 100 years from now, if people look back and say, oh, wow, if they had this particular technology, then the pandemic would not have been this bad. Just like now that we have penicillin, we look back when penicillin didn't exist and we were like, oh, wow, that would have changed the world. So do you see AI as the metaphorical penicillin? Do you see artificial intelligence as a way to handle incredibly difficult problems that the world is facing today? And how hardy will the world be if we have artificial intelligence really?
Yeah, we are facing, we always face complex problems in life. And the complexity of these problems, it varies. But sometimes we are not able to scale in terms of how to solve this complex problem. For instance, if I need, in order for me to solve a complex problem, I would need hundreds of thousands of pieces of information, and then I look at them and try to make a decision. As a human being, I cannot do that. One cannot look at, as a human being, as 100,000 pieces of information and make a decision on a complex problem like that. So what you need to do is to rely on machine to actually process this information and provide you with a decision support element of how to manage the crisis or the complex problem. So the pandemic, if you look at it, it has many, it's a multidimensional problem. It's a multidimensional complex problem which has the financial dimensions, the social dimension, the health dimension, and more. And each of these dimensions are huge in terms of input data to assess before you make a decision. If you are at the executive level, like a president or a politician in general, if you have all these pieces of information, how can you make a decision if you don't plug in all these pieces of information and process them? Now, what we mean by process them, some of the processing units of this decision support tool, if you like, could be based on models that are actually based on equations. But there could be others unit of this complex tool that rely on just data.
Interesting.
And these are data-driven model, if I may call them. We don't know how the cause and effects connect, but we know there is cause and effect. But we don't know how it works inside, in between. So what we do, we rely on observation data. We know what's going on as an effect, and we develop what we call data-driven models. So
are they in action right now, or are they in development?
Yes.
Do you think that it is going to be possible with artificial intelligence to help us predict when diseases will be jumping from the animal kingdom into humans?
That's a very, very good question. Yeah. If we have data, of, observation data, which is the cause, from the cause side, and look at data on the effects, so the transfer of the disease from animal to humans, if we have the whole data, then it becomes a system interesting to study and see how the transfer happens.
What if
The transfer happen could be happens because not just of that data, and there could be other influencing phenomena. So we need to look at the animal sort of reservoir and the human receptor and what's in between. We hear about live markets, people, the density of people matters, the environment, the meteorological condition matter. All of these needs to be put in one whole system, and perhaps you can use AI and train the system to get you that answer, and then test it on another condition, on another system, see if it works. But that's a very, very expensive experiment to do.
Well, the
very expensive.
Consequences are very expensive as well. So
the consequences are very expensive. So data is very, very valuable to have. So what the message here, we need to sense all our environments. We need to gather all this data to actually develop the next generation of AI-based tools to actually connect such data and see how the cause and effect processes happen.
Yeah, what happens if you don't have all the data? Can the computer try to fill in the blank and say, in this situation, then this will happen, in that situation, this will happen? Can the computer fill in the blank?
The computer can only give sensible answers if it's already trained. But there are many ways of training the computer. In computer science, or in AI, we talk about supervised learning or unsupervised learning. There's also that. We may not do the training by forcing it, by feeding it with data to understand how things work. But there are other emerging algorithms where we just show it the data, we don't train it, we let it train itself. That's through basically new algorithms that look at how the data in feature space, so-called feature space, how the data contributes. Because data has values, but it represents features. You know, when we do a measurement of temperature, temperature is a feature. When we measure pressure, that's another feature. So that's two sets of data representing two features, okay? But if we have 100,000 features, so lots of measurements, but we let the computer see how the features distribute on its own, it will understand on its own how these features matter, which one matters most to actually predict. So not all features contribute to the effect. They are the causal part. The effect, they don't contribute in an equal manner on the effect, right? Same thing with cancer. For instance, you know, people's lifestyle matters on predicting whether they're going to catch cancer. You know, if someone smokes for 20 years, there is a risk that they catch cancer. We know that. We've done that through observation. So we are sure. But there is also now an emerging topic where we look at the affinity for catching the disease through the genomic data. Now, the genomic data, we all have our DNA signatures, and the way they are could tell a lot whether we are vulnerable to a particular disease or not. But we need to be observed for many for a good period of time where the lifestyle also matters. But this is emerging. This is not an established medicine yet, but we are going towards that. Through the lifestyle, through our genomic data, we are able to say that for instance, someone who is 20 and we start recording the data, for instance, you know, and plus the genomic makeup of this person, we might be able through machine to predict the likelihood for catching a particular disease by the age of 30, 40, 50, and so on. So it is possible. I believe as a mathematician, as a data scientist, if I get the data, I can study that. Yeah, but this is really personalized medicine. This is really a model that actually predicts for this particular person. Unlike the medicine that is based now, we get a particular treatment which is the same for hundreds or millions of people. Mm-hmm. So personalized medicine is the emerging medicine in this century as well. Thanks to data science, we can sort of specialize at the patient level.
Make sure I understand that properly. So you're saying that the way medicine is practiced, just like in veterinary medicine, we look at studies with big data, right? And then we craft as clinicians, we craft our plan to treat our patients according to what has been shown through many either studies or very large size studies, because we work off of statistics. We say, okay, this is the most likely. Yeah. But what you've been saying is that in the future, it sounds like in the near future, we will have the data, we'll have the capacity because of computers to not necessarily look at um, the studies and say, okay, because this tends to work for the average person, then we're going to give you the medication for this. But instead, especially for the rare diseases where we don't have big data, it would be more specialized, more specific medication for that individual because we know the different variables uh, that are contributing to this one patient's health. Am I hearing
Uh,
you?
you are correct. Yes, absolutely. And what is exciting about AI here is that these models actually they can be retrained according to whatever input we want to provide for the training or the self-training of these algorithms. So if I develop an algorithm that actually looks after one particular patient, I can use the same algorithm, retrain it or self-retrain it for another patient. But this is a future vision. This is we are not doing it in an operational way nowadays yet. We are not. We haven't done it yet. But I'll give you an example, for instance, where I'm studying with my student, doing some research with my postgraduate students on the impact of the environmental condition on patients with COPD conditions. You know, this is the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Basically, the weather actually matters in the well-being and the health of these patients. But the weather is different wherever we go. So how can we personalize the care of these patients if we don't do AI? If we do AI, which I'm doing with my students at the moment, it's not a completed work, but we will publish it soon, where, for instance, you look at the weather conditions for where the patient is, and we try to predict the exacerbation event 4 or 5 days ahead of time. If we have the weather forecast, we are able to predict the likelihood of exacerbation event for this particular patient.
Wow.
So if we are able to do that, then 4 days ahead of time, we can send the community nurse to look after this patient instead of the patient being at the exacerbation event and go to hospital, and they could go to critical care.
Right.
This is how you save the patient from getting to critical care ahead of time, and also save the hospitals to focus on more critical conditions, you know, looking for emergencies and where people need immediate care. So, and having said that, patients with COPD, we're talking about hundreds of thousands in a region.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine we have all that data at the patient level, and we are able to focus on predicting those exacerbation events and sending.
That's incredible. That's really exciting. And it's wonderful to see that you have a lens for the future, which is really, really wonderful to hear. Now, when it comes to the complicated One Health challenges that we are experiencing on this planet between climate change and water scarcity and all the issues that go along with that, it sounds like people who are One Health advocates really need to befriend and be involved with data scientists and people who are working towards artificial intelligence, because that sounds like it's the way forward. Am I hearing you correctly on that?
Yes, the point we haven't discussed is how to regulate the use of data for research. It is important to point out that as a data scientist, my first duty is to get through the ethics committees to enable me to do the research. So in each UK universities, there is this in place, and I'm sure in the US and elsewhere in Europe, there is the GDPR regulations, what we call the general data protection regulations in Europe, where basically you have the duty to protect the data that you or whoever owns the data, so that you pursue the research. It's not new when you think about it. When we go to see our local doctor or GP, as we call it here, we deliver information that is personal to the GP by while we believe and we trust our doctor that he or she will protect our information. This is it. So the data scientist is in the same position as the GP for actually using the data for a good cause, if I may call it, for reaching out into solving or contributing into solving specific problems of social values or economic values or both. So understanding how climate is impacting on our lives, we need to get access to the data, observation data, so that we develop very performing AI-based algorithm actually to save this planet, to save humanity. That's very important. So there needs to be a trust between the data scientists and those who deliver the data to them to work on.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
we a whole day's conversation on that front. So yeah, and it reminds me of an interview that I had earlier a few weeks ago with Dr. Brian Little about how different experiences have led to different perceptions of our reality. And what
Sure.
I'm getting out of this conversation is that the way the world is getting more and more complicated with the problems that we have to solve. And it looks like the way forward really has to include artificial intelligence if we ever want to have a real hope of solving these problems. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor
Thank you.
Sabeur. Really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure the audience has learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you
Thank you
again.
very much. Thank you very much.
Onwards and upwards, everybody. I'll see you next time. Bye.